The Ardennes in December of 1944 was a place of deep shadows and deeper cold, a forest where snow smothered the ground and mist clung to the branches like a shroud. For the soldiers of both sides, it was a living nightmare, not only because of the enemy but because of the relentless winter that froze their fingers, stiffened their boots, and stole their breath with every step. Into that frozen wilderness the Germans launched their desperate last offensive, a gamble meant to split the Allies, seize key supply lines, and force a negotiated peace. It would be called the Battle of the Bulge, and though it began with surprise and fury, it ended with lessons carved into history, lessons carried home by men who never forgot what they saw. The German plan was bold. Columns of tanks and infantry smashed into thin American lines, shoving them back through snow-choked villages, overwhelming positions that had been thought quiet sectors. Young American soldiers who had believed they were in a resting area suddenly found themselves in the path of Tiger tanks. Panic spread in those first days, but so did resolve. Out of the chaos came stories of small groups holding crossroads, of clerks and cooks grabbing rifles, of battered divisions refusing to break. The world remembers Bastogne and the stubborn defense there, but less often do we hear of what was happening above and behind those snowy woods, where the thunder of artillery began to write a different story. For the Americans had brought with them a secret. Packed into crates that looked no different from any other supply shipment were proximity fuses, a piece of technology so carefully guarded that even many frontline soldiers did not know how they worked. These tiny marvels used radio waves to sense their distance from a target, detonating a shell not when it hit the ground but when it came near enough to shred men, tanks, or planes with maximum effect. To the artillerymen who handled them, they were simply orders in a box. Fit these fuses, fire as directed. To the Germans on the receiving end, they were something closer to sorcery. Hans Müller was a sergeant in one of the Volksgrenadier divisions thrown into the offensive. He had fought since Poland, seen the frozen hell of the Russian front, and believed he had grown used to every kind of shellfire imaginable. But on the third day of the push, as his unit moved through a clearing in the woods, the sky erupted in a way he had never seen. American shells burst not in the ground but above it, high enough that the fragments rained down on the entire column. Men fell screaming into the snow, wounded by blasts they could not dodge, and the sense of safety that came from hugging the earth vanished. Hans remembered throwing himself into a ditch, pressing his face into the freezing mud, and realizing that the air itself had turned against them. Years later, telling his grandson about that day, he shook his head slowly. It was as if the Americans had found a way to see us through the trees. We thought perhaps they had devils on their side. On the American side, Private Jack Thompson, a farm boy from Ohio, worked the heavy 155mm gun with numb hands. He had been in combat for weeks already, but the Bulge was different, fiercer, darker. The snow was both an enemy and a blanket, hiding movement but chilling him to the bone. When his unit was issued the new fuses, the sergeant had simply said, "These are special. Fit them right. Don't ask questions." Jack didn't. He shoved the fuses into shells, rammed them into the breech, and pulled the lanyard. The gun bucked like a beast, and seconds later he heard the thuds of explosions far out in the woods. But these sounded different, sharper, crisper, followed by a chorus of echoing cries that carried even over the roar. Jack didn't smile. He only looked at his buddy and muttered, "Guess they work." What happened next across the front was nothing short of staggering. German units advancing through the trees found themselves decimated. Assaults that might have overrun thin American lines were shattered before they could close the distance. Shells detonated over roads, shredding columns of men and horses alike. In open fields, proximity fuses turned advancing waves into broken remnants. The Germans, already stretched thin and desperate, began to lose momentum. Officers shouted for men to keep moving, but the fear was too strong. They could no longer trust the cover of woods or trenches. Every place seemed exposed, every step vulnerable to the unseen eye of American gunnery. For the men in the foxholes, the difference was felt in their bones. Young infantrymen who had crouched in terror as German attacks closed in now heard the pounding of their own guns, saw the results, and realized they might survive after all. In a frozen orchard outside Bastogne, a soldier scribbled in his journal, "The guns are angels. When the shells burst above them, I feel God is on our side." But war is never one-sided glory. For every German formation broken by proximity fuses, American batteries were still shelled by counterfire. Jack Thompson lost his closest friend, Eddie, when a mortar round landed beside their gun. He buried Eddie in the snow that night, marking the grave with a helmet. As he smoked a cigarette under a sky lit by distant flares, he thought of Eddie's mother back in Indiana, who would never know how her son died. The new fuses had saved lives, yes, but they could not save everyone. That truth gnawed at Jack long after the war. Hans Muller, too, carried scars. He survived several barrages, losing comrades in each. Once, as his unit retreated through a village, shells burst over the rooftops, collapsing houses and scattering soldiers. He remembered the look on a young boy's face as his father was cut down beside him. Hans dragged the child into a cellar, not out of duty but because in that moment he saw his own son's face reflected in the boy's tears. He knew then that Germany was finished, no matter what Hitler promised. No army could endure forever against enemies who wielded such weapons and such resolve. The Battle of the Bulge dragged on for weeks, the cold biting harder than bullets, the snow stained red in countless places. The Germans had hoped to reach the Meuse River, to split the Allies, but they never got that far. Proximity fuses were not the only reason. The bravery of the infantry, the resilience of the paratroopers at Bastogne, the eventual return of Allied air power all played their roles. Yet historians would later note that without the fuses, the German advances might have gone much further, might have inflicted even greater losses. Technology, married to courage, had tipped the scale. When the battle ended and the German offensive was broken, the snow began to melt into mud that swallowed helmets and rifles left behind. American soldiers trudged on into Germany, weary but hardened. Jack Thompson was among them. He carried no souvenirs, only a small notebook where he wrote down the names of those he lost. He returned home in 1945, stepping off a train into the arms of his mother. For years he rarely spoke of the war, but every December, when the wind howled across the Ohio fields, he would fall silent and remember the Ardennes. One night, when his children asked him what he had learned, he finally spoke. Don't think you can ever see everything life has to throw at you. Sometimes what saves you is something you never imagined existed. And sometimes, what destroys you is what you never took seriously. Hans Muller also came home, though to ruins. Captured in the spring of 1945, he spent months in an American prisoner camp. To his surprise, he was treated with decency, even kindness. The guards shared food when rations allowed, sometimes cigarettes, sometimes even jokes. It shook him, because he had been told Americans were monsters. When he finally returned to Germany, he set about rebuilding, carrying with him not just the memory of shells bursting overhead but the knowledge that enemies could also be men, and that respect was wiser than arrogance. To his grandson he later said, "Never laugh at someone you face, never think they cannot surprise you. Pride blinds. Respect keeps you alive." For both men, American and German, the proximity fuses became symbols, not only of technological power but of life's ability to surprise, to change the course of fate in an instant. For the soldiers, they were the difference between living and dying. For the generations that came after, they became metaphors. Life will always hold what you cannot see, cannot plan for, cannot believe until it is upon you. To mock, to dismiss, to believe oneself invincible, that is the road to ruin. To prepare, to respect, to endure, that is the path to survival. Decades later, veterans returned to the Ardennes. Old men now, walking with canes, they stood in silent forests where the snow fell softly once again. Jack Thompson touched a tree scarred by shrapnel and closed his eyes. He could almost hear the guns, feel the cold, smell the smoke. Hans Muller stood a short distance away, brought there by his grandson. The two men's eyes met, strangers once, enemies once, and yet in that shared silence they both knew they had survived the same storm. No words were needed. The forest remembered for them. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields where so many had fallen, the lesson of that winter remained. Never underestimate what you cannot see. Never mock what you do not understand. Life's fiercest blows often come from the skies you think are empty. The Germans had learned it the hard way when proximity fuses shattered their formations. The Americans had learned it in survival and loss, in the knowledge that invention can save but also wounds. And all of us, listening to their stories generations later, can carry the truth forward, that humility, resilience, and respect are stronger than arrogance, and that the surprises of life, whether born of war or peace, are what shape us into who we are meant to be.